The Friday the 13th timeline is a mess. The Jason Voorhees saga has a lot of twists and turns, few dead ends, and a veritable shitload of convoluted nonsense. But damn it, if I don't love these crazy movies and come back to them time and time again. This is another one of those ultra-researched, out-in-the-weeds, nitpicky deep dives that will take you through all of those wacky twists and turns, and beyond the woods where you'll come out the other side, possibly questioning even your own reality. Sound like fun? Let's get into it.
Okay.
For starters, in this video I'll mostly be exploring the timeline within the world of the movies themselves. Only when necessary for context will I bother correlating the fictional universe with our real one. Another quick note, I'm also solely looking at the films associated with this franchise, and not comic books, TV shows, novels, or video games. And I'm omitting fan films, which this property has a lot of. I will cover these things somewhat and point out certain connective elements, but for the purpose of my own sanity, I'm only considering the official released films canonical. Don't worry though if you're one of those weirdos, like me, that wants to hear about all the offshoots and tie-ins and ephemeral goofiness. We'll get into some minutia, trust me. The events depicted in the first film technically begin in 1958. The first scene we see in the series involves some camp counselors hanging out in a cabin at Camp Crystal Lake, having a fun little sing-along while an unknown entity sneaks around undetected. Wait a minute, this is 1958? I believe the guitar she's playing is a silver-toned student acoustic sunburst parlor guitar. You could buy these at Sears, starting in 1961. Are we supposed to believe this is some magical time-traveling guitar? I mean, Mr. Cunningham, what kind of game is being played here? Okay, maybe I'm starting off a little hot. I'm gonna take it down a peg. We got a lot more ground to cover. The song they're singing is a Civil War era spiritual, usually called Michael Row the Boat Ashore, popular among freed slaves around South Carolina. The version they sing name-checks the River Jordan, where Jesus was baptized, and is often used as a metaphor for salvation. But in this case, it just gets these two camp counselors all horned up, and they leave the group for a one-way trip to Pound Town. Unfortunately for them, they take a wrong turn and end up in get your ass stabbed offville. Then we see the fun Glass Smash title and some of the most dynamic opening credits of the era. Or not. And here's where our true timeline starts. The present. Shit. So the film was released in the US on May 9th, 1980. The title card says Friday, June 13th, the present. So is this meant to be 1980? There actually was a Friday, June 13th in 1980, so let's go with that for now. So we've jumped 22 years ahead from the opening scene. We see the lovely Robbie Morgan as Annie hiking along with an oversized backpack. We spend a fair amount of time with her. She'll probably be really important to the plot, right? Quick side note, see this shot here? This is what old school Hollywood editors called shoe leather, which describes unnecessary scenes that amount to watching characters wear down the soles of their shoes, literally in this case. For low-budget films, it usually serves to pad out the running time. We hear from Crazy Ralph that Camp Crystal Lake is now known as Camp Blood. Scary. And we hear from the truck driver who is called Truck Driver in the credits, but is clearly named Enos.
The crossroads, Enos?
That the camp is jinxed, and that a boy drowned in 57. We later discover that this is little Jason Voorhees. So the story that Mrs. Voorhees relays at the end of the movie supposedly happened the year before the two opening murders. Hey, this timeline stuff is easy. What is everybody bitching about? So Mrs. Voorhees says that today is Jason's birthday, June 13th. If he died in 57, and let's just assume for a moment that we're using real-world dates as a guide, there was a Friday, June 13th in 1947 and 1952. Now, she never confirms that Jason was born on a Friday, but the day and date are played as significant throughout the series, so perhaps Jason was either 10 or 5 when he died. Based on his appearance in the flashback shots, I'm going with 10. Mrs. Voorhees gets separated from her head, and we move on to part 2. Side note, how did they not get Steve Miner to direct My Bloody Valentine? I mean, it's right there. Miner? That's nothing. Let's move on. In the beginning of part 2, we see Alice reliving the events of part 1 in an extended dream sequence. Shoe leather. The story goes that Adrienne King opted out of being the lead in part 2, in part because of an issue with the amount of money she was being offered, but also possibly a stalker. We'll dig deeper into that story in another video. So she gets fitted for a wooden kimono in the opening scene, and then we have Amy Steele taking over as the new final girl. But not really, because that term wasn't put forth until 1987, when Carol J. Clover coined it in an article called Her Body Himself, Gender in the Slasher Film. And if you think the title is pretentious, you should read the article. Or don't. I don't really give a shit. Point is, she watched some slasher movies and figured out that girls usually emerge as the heroes. What would we do without academics? A scary prospect. We've got some new characters here. They're heading to a different camp, but on the same lake. Camp, something or other, which apparently is just a training camp for counselors. How many camps are on this lake? It's still a little unclear how much time is supposed to have passed since the events of the last film. They find a sign for Camp Crystal Lake, and the character of Ted makes mention of Camp Blood.
It's Camp Blood. This place is on the same lake as we're gonna be.
Okay, now this is where the timeline starts to get goofy. Remember how the main motivation for the killer in the first film was that her son Jason drowned while the counselors were doing the horizontal monkey dance? Well, get that out of your head, because according to our fearless leader Paul, they never found Jason's body. And the old-timers in town think he's still out there, surviving in the wilderness. Makes sense. He talks about Alice and how she disappeared 2 months later, so I guess we're assuming the prologue happened around August of 1980. And he says this.
We're the first to return here. 5 years. 5 long years he's been dormant.
5 years ago. So if the last movie took place in 1980, we're calling this 1985, and Jason is still alive somehow? So, if Jason was thought to have died in the lake back in 1957 when he was a boy, and it's now 1985, he would be close to 40 years old already. But the franchise is just getting started. Well, they're gonna make Hugh Jackman play Wolverine until he's 110, so this isn't too far-fetched by Hollywood standards. Then we go into part 3.
That's my good boy. That's a good boy.
Shoe leather. Does this opening music number remind you guys of the Goosebumps theme, or is it just me? Jason is not dead, apparently. We see a news report that Jenny was just taken to the hospital. So we have to presume this is the day after the events of part 2. Now we're cooking. We have some friends heading to a vacation home out on the lake, including Chris, Ah, Chris. Let's gaze upon her for a moment. Was that creepy? It was creepy, wasn't it? Let's move on. You can clearly see issues of magazines and comic books from 1982 in this shot. That Master of Kung Fu issue is from May of 82. That's the one where Shang-Chi fought the guy and the thing. And listen, I'm going to be honest with you, I never read Master of Kung Fu. It always looked so pointless and stupid. Thank God they never tried to adapt it for the screen.
Thank you.
But this is supposed to be 1985. How long do they keep things on the shelf in New Jersey? I'm seeing some cracks forming in the continuity. Chris tells a story about an encounter with Jason when she was last at the lake 2 years ago. I guess that means Jason was up to his shenanigans before the events of Part 2, back in 1983. Kinda weird, considering that this is what Jason looked like in 1985 based on the second film. Here he seems to be basically wearing the same outfit he has on in Part 3, but without the mask. We see his face in Part 2 as well, and he looks completely different. Sorry, no. Here. Not even close. But of course, like the previous films in the series, Part 2 seems to end with a dream sequence. So I guess you could make the argument that this is just Ginny's imagination and outside of the actual continuity of the series or some shit. In the end, Chris picks up an axe while Jason is distracted chopping up one of the bikers and firmly plants it in his head. He appears to be vanquished. She floats herself out onto the lake, similar to Alice in the first movie, and promptly falls asleep. When she wakes up, it's daylight. We have a few fake scares, and then she sees Jason looking at her from a window. He bolts out the door toward her, but then seems to vanish when she looks away for a moment in panic. Before you can say, "Oh God, it's just a dream," the rotted, fetid corpse of Mrs. Voorhees pops up and grabs her, pulling her into the lake, just like the Jason popping up sequence in the first film. But it turns out that was all a dream, or something. And the cops pull Chris out of the barn and cart her away to the loony bin, presumably. Are they just gonna leave his body there? Doesn't matter. Part 4. They called this one The Final Chapter. Hilarious. The movie begins with a greatest hits recap that takes up almost 3 minutes of running time. More shoe leather. And more ultra-dynamic credits. Hey, that shit cost money back then. And then our news story starts right at the tail end of the previous movie, with the cops retrieving Jason's body from the barn. After the first responders engage in some sparkling dialogue,
What's wrong with him? He's dead.
we stretch out the runtime a little more by watching them load the body into the ambulance and drive away. They even hold on a dark, empty shot of the barn after the ambulance disappears in the distance for close to 9 seconds. Let's keep it moving, people. So we're thinking this is still 1985. The movie was released on April 13th, 1984 in the US. So technically, it's still set in the future if you're tying it to the previous films. After a protracted hospital sequence in which we see 2 murders and multiple clips from the 1981 Canadian-produced workout video, Aerobicize, 2 new sets of characters are introduced. The Jarvis family, which includes a mom, daughter Trish, and younger son Tommy, who we first see playing Zaxxon on a Trash 80 Coco, aka TRS-80 color from Radio Shack. These were later sold under the name Tandy and first hit the market in September of 1980. It was an upgrade from the previous TRS-80 monochrome version, which was similar in name only and was pretty much a completely different computer. The game Zaxxon was introduced by Sega as a stand-up coin-op in 1982 and is the very first arcade game to be advertised on television. They paid Paramount Pictures $150,000 to produce the ad. Wait a minute. Paramount Pictures? The same company that distributed the Friday the 13th movies? But that means this is most likely product placement. Don't you just love learning about corporate synergy, folks? The Jarvis family lives on the lake, and the mom mentions that some kids are renting the cabin next door, whom we meet as they're driving to the lake. They stop for a moment to get their bearings, conveniently right next to a small graveyard where there's a tombstone for Pamela Voorhees. Who the hell is that, you ask? Well, most horror fans now know that Pamela is Jason's mother, but in the film series, we haven't seen that name up to this point, only knowing her as Mrs. Voorhees, even in the end credits. So this may have been a bit confusing to audiences at the time. Also, who buried her and mounted this tombstone? And double also, why does it say she died in 1979? We were going on the assumption that part 1 was set in the summer of 1980. Does this change the timeline, and now we have to reset all the presumed dates? Possibly. As I stated before, June 13th was on a Friday in 1980. But not in 79. So it was an easy assumption since the title card said present day. But the film was shot in the late summer, early fall of 1979. So I guess the present day designation could be considered right, and we just need to forget real-world historical date accuracy. You could say they never openly stated the year in the movie or anything official tied to the movie, so...
On a June night in 1980, Friday the 13th, 12 of her friends were murdered. Why should Friday the 13th, 1981 be any different? Friday the 13th, Part 2.
Shit. But wait, did they also say that Part 2 takes place in 81? But...
5 years. 5 long years.
Hey kids, continuity is tough. Best left to the professionals. I kid. I know that back in the early 80s, the filmmakers never predicted that 40 years later they would have some shut-in like me dissecting the franchise timeline in such ludicrous detail. But, I mean, at least watch the previous film through once. Jot down some notes. Okay. Noting that the first movie must have taken place in 79 because of the tombstone is the approach a lot of people online have taken. But is there another possible answer? Up to this point, we know very little about what Mrs. Voorhees was up to in the time between the murders in 58 and the story depicted in part 1. It's possible that the tombstone is inaccurate. I mean, it's a mystery as to who actually placed the grave marker. Maybe Pamela placed it herself to fake her own death before the murder spree in the summer of 80. That might sound silly, but there's plenty of silliness in this franchise. We haven't even scratched the surface yet. The grave also shows Pamela's birth date is 1930, so if we trust its veracity, in part 1 she would have been around 50. Actress Betsy Palmer was born in 1926, so her age and the age of the character weren't too far off. The Jarvis offspring has some car trouble and get help from a random backpacker who isn't suspicious at all.
Rob Dyer. How about kids? Are any kids, vacationers, people like that?
Turns out his name is Rob. He hitches a ride to the Jarvis's house and goes straight up to hang out alone in Tommy's room.
Who's your friend? Mom, this is Rob. Rob, this is my mother.
Hello, this is...
Jarvis?
Sure, great idea. Another great idea, he stays at the house until after dark and then decides to set out hiking. Don't worry though, Trish makes sure to tell this total stranger that sometimes Tommy is home alone and usually leaves the door open. Very trusting young lady.
We're always home. And if we're not, Tommy usually leaves the door open.
So then Jason dispatches half the cast and we learn that Rob is really up there looking for Jason because he thinks he killed Rob's sister Sandra, who was the character played by Marta Korber in Part 2. Now, here's a small bone of contention I have with some of the other timeline breakdowns of this series. One thing we do know is that Sandra from Part 2 was killed around 1985, or I guess 84 if you believe the tombstone, and that the events of Part 3 happened immediately afterward. The beginning scene of Part 4 starts up the same night as the end of Part 3 because we see them taking Jason's body away, but the question is, how much time transpired between the scene of Jason in the hospital and the scene where we're introduced to the Jarvises on the lake? Some assume that it's the next day, but that doesn't really make any sense to me. It could be, but there's nothing to indicate that. But there are clues that at least a few days have passed. For one, we see Mrs. Jarvis reading a newspaper with headlines, "Mass Murderer's Body Missing," and "Police Investigate Missing Body." The thing is, at the time, newspapers were primarily printed overnight and distributed in the morning. If this is the next day, as some have hypothesized, it would be pretty unbelievable that this would be the headline the next morning, especially at a small county paper with limited staff. Rob is there looking for his sister's killer, which, if this was the day after the end of Part 3, means that only a few days have passed since she was killed in Part 2. He has newspaper clippings from the Part 1 murders and the events of the subsequent films, including one about the disappearance of Jason's body from the morgue. It's implausible that this is the next day. More likely, at least a few days, if not a week, have gone by. And I know I don't need to say it, but Jason looks completely different in this movie than the last. When they finally reveal his face, we see this. But in the last movie, he looked like this. But also, how badass is this Tom Savini gag where his head slides down the machete? Very badass. That's how much badass it is. Let's move on. Turns out Part 4, the final chapter, was not the final anything, and in 1985 we get Part 5, A New Beginning. As the films go on, this will end up taking its place as Part 2 of the Tommy Jarvis trilogy. So, how much time has passed in the timeline of the films? Part 4 was likely set in 1985. This film was released in 85. But we learn that Tommy was 12 in that story, but now appears to be an older teenager. He gets sent to a camp for troubled teens called Pinehurst, where very quickly one of the campers gets rage murdered. And the killer gets hauled away. One of the paramedics seems very upset by this, with an ominous music cue and everything. I wonder if that might pay off later. Anywho, we get to see a glimpse of Tommy's medical chart, and it has dates next to the notations. Hallelujah. This should help set everything straight. It says that he was prescribed Thorazine in late 1976, or is it 78? Hard to tell. If he was 12 in the previous movie, based on this piece of dialogue,
severe trauma at age 12.
and that movie took place in either 84 or 85, do they prescribe Thorazine to preschoolers? I mean, they did me, but I'm special. I've been profiled in medical journals, no fooling. But I digress. The latest date on the chart appears to be 1985, which, to remind you, is the year the movie came out. But that doesn't track with the previous time jumps, and the one between the last movie and this one, which has to be 5 or 6 years at least, based on how much Tommy has aged. So does that mean the previous film actually took place around 1980? And we have to jump back to like 1975 for the first film? That doesn't make sense for a shit ton of reasons. But if this was 1985, then the chart would make more sense because he would have been prescribed Thorazine when he was like 9 or 10. I guess that seems more reasonable. Either way, it's an incoherent mess. I think we're just looking at another case of filmmakers just setting the current movie in the current year and saying the hell with the previous films. Let's see if there's more evidence that this is supposed to be 85 versus somewhere around 1990, which would sit better with the timeline up until this point. We see a calendar in this scene, which shows the month of October, and the dates seem to match up with October of 85 in the real world. But who knows? Sometimes people forget to change the calendar for, several years, I guess. After a bunch more murders, we find out that there was no Jason after all. But in fact, it was the paramedic from the beginning seeking revenge because it was his son that was killed. A lot of people kind of hated this twist, so the next movie, of course, was called Jason Lives. Released in 1986, Tommy is played by Tom Matthews in this one, and is so haunted by the specter of Jason, he and his buddy dig up the killer's corpse and inadvertently bring him back to life through the power of electricity. I tried this with a dead rabbit in our backyard when I was a kid, but it didn't work, and my dad told me to put the car battery back in the station wagon. I was a whimsical child. Tommy gets arrested, and we learn that since the events of Part 4, Crystal Lake has been renamed Forest Green. The movie doesn't make it clear how much time has passed since Part 5, but when we last saw Tommy in that film, he was donning the Jason mask and acting a little, cuckoo. We quickly learn at the beginning of Jason Lives that he's been in a facility. A lot of online sources say that this is meant to be a year after Part 5, but that only seems to be based on the original script for this one, stating his age is 18 years old. I guess we'll go with it. So we'll call this 90 or 91. Just in case you were wondering, that badass vintage motorhome that's a rockin', I believe is a 1974 Cobra Century, made in the USA. These things have become collector's items to a certain crowd. You can see one here in episode 7 of the TV series Moving On from 74. Moving On was a show about an old school truck driver played by Claude Atkins, who acted in 4 million pieces of episodic television going back to the early 50s. He's paired up with a college-educated youngster, and hilarity ensues. What does this have to do with the Friday the 13th movies? Nothing. But the show did feature some actors known for memorable horror roles, including Clint Howard, John Vernon, of course from Killer Clowns and Curtains, among other things. Even Hitchcock blonde Janet Leigh pops up in an episode named Wedding Bells. There's more, but let's get back on track. Where were we? Oh yeah, Jason Lives. Tommy decides that they have to return Jason to the lake where he drowned as a kid, so they head to Lake Forest Green. Sheriff Garris comes face to face with Jason and momentarily puts him down with a shotgun. But of course that doesn't work and a chase ensues. We take a quick break for this comedy gem.
So, what were you gonna be when you grew up?
And then Jason catches up to the sheriff and folds him up like a cheap lawn chair. Meanwhile, the Bickersons...
Aren't you listening to me?
Yes, and I said hand me the padlock.
Here, you're gonna be sorry.
I hope not.
attach a chain to a rock and provoke Jason by insulting him several times.
That's it. Come on, maggot head. Come on. Come on, maggot head. That's it. Come on.
Draw him into the water A fight breaks out on the boat, surrounded by flames, and Tommy manages to loop a chain around Maggot Head's neck, trapping him at the lake's bottom, right next to the old Camp Crystal Lake / Camp Blood sign, for good measure. Megan assaults him with an outboard motor propeller, and she and Tommy make it to shore, leaving Jason submerged and chained to the rock below. Now, if I was classically educated, I'd probably take a moment to point out the clear parallel between Jason and the story of Prometheus from Greek mythology. You know, the one where Zeus punishes Prometheus by chaining him to a rock and having an eagle eat his liver every day, only for it to regenerate overnight, so the cycle of torture continues. But luckily for you, my education consisted mostly of Saturday morning cartoons and Archie Digest, so I'll leave that pretentious bullshit to the academic types I mentioned earlier. Let's move on. In 1988, one of the best years of all time for movies, in my humble opinion, we got Friday the 13th, The New Blood. This is the first one where Kane Hodder appeared as Jason, and they added in a little telekinesis aspect because why the hell not? So where are we on the timeline? We see Jason still chained up at the bottom of the lake in a different outfit for some reason. So this is after the end of Jason Lives, but it's also flashback because we see the lake and a younger version of our lead, Tina. The calendar says October 13th, and the real world there wasn't another October 13th on a Friday until 1995. Could be, especially when we see that a house has been built and the camp seems to have evaporated. We know it's the same basic spot because Jason is still there at the bottom of the lake, although I guess whoever changed his clothes could have moved him. Anyway, for now, let's call this 95 and see what blind alley that sends us down. Tina accidentally uses her 11 powers to send her dad to the bottom of the lake, just like Jason. Then we jump forward a bit to an older version of Tina, but it's not clear how old. Lara Park Lincoln was 26 at the time of filming, but it seems as though she's playing a fair bit younger. Still, it's clear that she's at least 6 or 7 years older than the flashback, so for the moment, let's guess that this was around 2002. The film's director, John Carl Buechler, said in an interview that Jason was chained to the bottom of the lake for like 10 years. I know it's a bit ridiculous, but look at how much everything has changed. Camp gone, house built. The area is no longer called Forest Green. It's now back to Crystal Lake. Also, what happened to Tommy and Megan? They were alive at the end of the last movie. Did they tell anybody that Jason was down there? All those kids saw the whole thing go down. Surely they all would have been in intensive therapy after that, telling a team of mental health professionals about the fact that Jason's body is still chained to that rock. Instead, nobody says anything, and they just let people build a house right there a few hundred feet away. If you rewatch the end of Jason Lives, you can see that he is able to reach and grab Megan's leg while she's trying to swim to shore with Tommy, her head above water. He's less than 6 feet below the surface. You'd be able to just look down and see him on a sunny day. Okay, I know. It's only a movie. So Tina and her mom head up to Crystal Lake for a retreat with Tina's psychiatrist. Next door, we see a group of young potential victims. Turns out the doc is looking to exploit her telekinetic powers. I believe the camcorder he's using to uncomfortably film her is a RCA Pro Wonder CMR 300 with a piece of gaff tape covering up the logo. I'm pretty sure anyway. These were very popular in 1987. Of course, by the early 2000s, mini DV cameras had completely taken over the market, but, you know, messy timeline. Tina goes to the lake, possibly in an attempt to resurrect her dead father, who I guess they just left down there? But accidentally brings back scary decomposed Jason instead. Whoopsie. There's supposed to be a surprise birthday party at the house, but these two ding-dongs have an automobile failure and end up walking. That's Billy Butler playing ding-dong number 2/birthday boy Michael. You might recognize him from other horror gems like Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3 and Tom Savini's Night of the Living Dead remake. He's also a director who has made a lot of schlock for Full Moon Films, stuff like Ginger Dead Man 2 and the Demonic Toys spin-off Baby Oopsie. You guys don't give a shit. Back to the timeline. Jason kills a bunch of people in various ways, including the infamous sleeping bag against a tree gag. Then Tina does a nifty trick where she uses the Force to shock the shit out of Jason with some power lines, but he just takes a little mud nap and gets up to continue the chase. We have this pretty badass stair stunt followed by another pretty badass basement fall, and then we top off the scene with this even more badass fire burn. If you know anything about Kane Hodder's history, it's damn ballsy for him to work around fire at all, let alone an extended full-body burn like this. Gotta respect that. Finally, in one of the weirder Jason Vanquish scenes, Tina is finally able to resurrect her dead father just long enough for him to jump up out of the lake and pull the killer back down into the murky depths. You guys getting sick of Crystal Lake? Well, apparently the producers were. And next they brought us Part 8, Jason Takes Manhattan, in 1989. Let's address some obvious temporal continuity problems here. In one of the opening New York City shots in the beginning montage, we see this shot of Times Square. See that big old Batman logo there? That's promoting Tim Burton's first Batman feature, which was released in the summer of 1989. The same year this was released. Actually, only about a month later. You could glean from that a 1989 setting for this film. But Jason is still underwater where they left him at the end of the last film, which, because of all the time jumps we've gone over, is at least set in the late 90s, if not early 2000s. What other breadcrumbs can we pick up here? This horn dog tells the story of Jason and Camp Crystal Lake. According to Boat Boy, Jason drowned about 30 years ago. Well, one of the few concrete dates we have been given so far is that Jason is supposed to have drowned back in 1957. Let's just do some quick math here. Carry the one. Yeah. 1957 plus 30 is 1987. I mean, I'm not too no good at math, but I think even I can put that one together. So even if we're saying this goofball is rounding up or down a bit, that would still place this in the late 80s. Now, of course, he could have gotten it wrong by more than a decade or so, but it's clear that with that line of dialogue in the obvious late 80s setting, that the producers of this film decided to disregard the time jumps of the previous movies and set up this one in a contemporary setting to the film's release, 1989. Also, did you notice the camp is back? Jason is at the bottom of the lake with pieces of old dock on top of him, and right there on shore, Crystal Lake Camp, a sign yet unseen in the franchise. I'll just shrug now. So, these two bimbos get murdered, and then we see, holy shit, this is Crystal Lake? Wow, looks a bit different. I don't remember a lot of lakes in New Jersey looking quite like this, but then again, I don't get out much. We have to assume that this is supposed to be Crystal Lake, or at least connected to it, because we saw the boat from the earlier scene floating nearby. We get this little exchange between one of the teachers and the principal.
Has everyone checked in?
No. Jim Miller and Susie Donaldson never showed up, and I'm more than a little concerned.
Well, don't be. They probably decided to explore each other rather than New York.
So, they were high school students in Crystal Lake, and this girl never heard of Jason Voorhees. Regardless of what year this is, many of the murders would have happened quite recently. I guess we'd just chalk it up to her being an idiot. I think she's, quote-unquote, shredding on a hot pink Gibson 67 Flying V reissue with the headstock painted to avoid logos. I think. Guess when they reissued these? Go on. 89. Fast forward past a bunch of killings. And the remaining characters end up in a lifeboat drifting toward the city, which they finally make it to around the 1 hour and 4 minute mark. But I bet all that waiting was worth it, because now Jason will finally take Vancouver. Yeah. Other than a few scenes, this movie was shot in Canada. There's this scene where the character Julius decides his best defense is to repeatedly hit a guy wearing a mask designed to mitigate damage caused by flying hockey pucks with his bare knuckles. Actor Vincent Dupree claims the blood on his hands was real. And then Jason knocks his whole head off with one punch. He probably learned that from watching Killer Clowns the previous year. We also see why Rennie doesn't like the water and has a few trust issues with her dickbag uncle. Who the hell knows when this was supposed to have happened in the timeline? But you might notice that little boy Jason was down there, I guess. It's assumed that when we see young Jason pop out of the lake in the first movie, it was a dream sequence, especially since Alice is killed by a full-grown Jason 2 months later. So what the hell is this? How does this make any sense at all? Rennie is graduating high school, and actress Amber Powlick, who plays young Rennie, looks to be about 10 or 11 in the flashback. So 6 or 7 years ago? Forget whatever year this is supposed to be. That would depict this as occurring slightly after the flashback scene in The New Blood, when full adult grown-ass Jason was already chained to the bottom of the lake at the end of a murder spree that started back in 1979 or 80, or whatever the hell. Also, why does he look like this here, but not in the earlier flashback, or when we see him in his child form later in the movie? Okay. Take a deep breath. Part 8 ends with one of the most absurd scenes I think I've ever witnessed, where the New York sewer is flooded with toxic waste, and then Jason emerges as a young boy in his underwear. Was it the toxic waste? Was it this random lightning strike? The answer, I guess, is up to each viewer to decide, after some heavy drugs and maybe a lobotomy. Wait, stop for a second. I want to make sure that my sometimes impressionable viewing audience doesn't think that I'm advocating for the use of lobotomies. I'm not. Heavy drugs, on the other hand. Just kidding. Get the lobotomy. This film was a bit of a flop for Paramount, and the Jason gravy train came to a screeching halt. It wasn't until 1993, and after some IP rights getting shifted around, that we would get Jason Goes to Hell, the final Friday. Final Friday. Hilarious. Did they maintain the timeline of the previous films? Well, depends on how you look at it. The opening scene is kind of fun, with a female FBI agent posing as a solo camper, only to reveal a sting operation where a SWAT team manages to blow Jason up into a million pieces. Of course, the last time we saw Jason, he was a little boy in the sewers of New York, and now he's back in Crystal Lake looking even more monstrous than he did before. I'm getting alternate timeline vibes, and also a headache. Let's see how this plays out. They take his remains to Youngstown, Ohio. Wait, why Youngstown? There is an FBI office in Youngstown, so I guess it makes sense that they would have a federal morgue facility there. But isn't Crystal Lake supposed to be in New Jersey? Or is this alternate timeline shit? Agent Marcus has Connecticut plates in the opening scene. And we see this sign. Believe it or not, there's a Fairfield, Westport, and a Crystal Lake in Connecticut. So, did we move the setting to Connecticut? There's a Fairfield in New Jersey as well, but almost every state in the Union has a Fairfield. Shit, I think Alabama has 2. But wait, this isn't even a geography video. What the hell am I talking about? Let's get back to the timeline. If this movie came out in 93, is it set in 93? I already made my case for why the previous films skewed out into the 2000s and then seemingly jumped back to the late 80s. So I'll look for clues on what the hell year this is supposed to be. Let's go back to this newscast.
Born in 1946 to Elias and Pamela Voorhees, Jason was believed to have drowned in Camp Crystal Lake at the tender age of 11.
So Jason was born in 46 and died at the age of 11 in 57. So far, the story matches up. We have this whole heart-munching, body-switching Voorhees relative storyline set up along with Creighton Duke, a bounty hunter who knows more about Jason than everybody else, apparently. They also say that his remains were flown to Youngstown, so I guess that explains that. And more murders on the way back to Crystal Lake, and they purposefully fail to mention which state. Not a geography video. Stop that. So Jason had a sister, and she gets killed, but Jason needs someone in his bloodline to be reborn. So he goes after the daughter who has a young baby. And then we see a Necronomicon. Wait, let me check that again. Yep, that's a thing. Wait a minute. Maybe that's why this timeline is so screwed up. Time travel. If Ash can do it. Anyway, cop car, Connecticut plates. Just saying. No additional info about a specific time frame that I could see, but Jason gets sucked down into hell, and the next movie to be released was Jason X in 2001. Now, here's the deal. If we're going chronologically, the next entry to the Jason story is Freddy vs. Jason, even though that came out in 2003. So we should probably do that one next. What do you think? Yeah? Okay. So I'm sure you have all seen this movie, but if not, I'm going to give you a quick breakdown. We open with a prologue with Freddy explaining in voiceover his whole deal. And we get this off-putting scene where he licks the picture of a little girl and puts it in a photo album. Gross. He explains that the parents of Springwood took him out, but he got the power to invade their kids' dreams. And that's when the fun really began. Greatest hits montage. Ending with Freddy yelling about how no one is afraid of him anymore. And shit like that. So he searched the bowels of hell to find someone who will make them remember. So Jason killing people makes them afraid of Freddy somehow. I don't know. Then we get a quick scene with a skinny dipping young lass who you might remember as the flashing biker chick from Final Destination 2. She runs around the woods before being accosted by Jason and then gets macheted to a tree and morphs into other versions of negligent camp counselors before his mom shows up and says this.
Mommy has something she wants you to do.
We meet the characters we're going to follow in this story, and not a single one of them would I ever want to spend time with in real life. These two have a private conversation about 3 feet away from the characters they're talking about. And American Mary decides to make out with her dude in the same room 4.5 feet away. And then Leather Jacket Dickhead guy gets craftmaticked by Jason while Ginger Snaps is in the shower. Not a single negative word about Katharine Isbell, but this ain't her. Turns out it's Canadian model and actress Tammy Morris, seen here discussing her affinity for pole dancing. You learn so much on this channel. We still have no clue where this movie is supposed to exist in the timeline. We hear that the cops know about Freddy Krueger, and that it's even the same house, although it looks completely different.
It's gotta be Freddy Krueger. Hey, don't even say that son of a bitch's name out loud.
Laurie overhears and at the police station summons the memory. So just to catch up, Freddy's plan in this movie is to revive Jason so that he would go on a random killing spree, but the locals would blame it on Krueger, and one of the young people might overhear them discussing it, and that would start the fear all over again, so he could become stronger and continue his reign of murderous mayhem. I guess I'm tracking. So, if you want a breakdown of how this movie fits in with the Nightmare on Elm Street timeline, go check out a video I did covering that a little while back. Or stay tuned for an updated version coming to this channel soon. But regardless, we do have one obvious clue as to when this movie is supposed to take place. See that sign? Spring 2004. So this must be 2003 or before, right around when this film was actually released. So like I said, this timeline is a mess. As we discussed, technically the story was up to about 2002, way back in part 8, and a lot of shit has happened since then. So we're left with Jason X and the remake. I'm omitting the remake because it restarts the whole story all over again and isn't intended to fit the previous continuity. But what about Jason X? According to the film's protagonist,
we executed him for the first time in 2008.
For the first time?
Mm-hmm. We tried everything. Electrocution, gas, firing squad. We even hung him once.
But none of that worked, so they decided to freeze his ass and figure it out later. Around 2010, there's a disagreement about what to do with him since certain parties want to study his ability to regenerate tissue. Meanwhile, a supposedly sedated Jason escapes and kills everyone except for one employee, Rowan, who manages to get him into the chamber, but before he can get turned into a Jason sickle, he stabs her through the door and they both end up frozen. Cut to a very long time later, a professor and some students on a space expedition land on Earth, which has been abandoned due to a habitability problem, and find Rowan and Jason in their cryogenically frozen states. How much time? Well,
Quadport 11. Manufactured in 2010. Precise historic records are inconsistent.
the year is now 2455. But the robot chick says that she's been frozen for 4.55 centuries.
Any idea how long she's been down?
4.55 centuries.
That's one hell of a wake-up call.
Which would be 2465 if they were frozen in 2010. But it's never stated if Earth 2 has the same solar cycle as Earth Prime, so that could explain the discrepancy. Also, she states that precise historic records are inconsistent. But more likely, the writers just screwed up the math. Either way, we're calling this 2055. So Jason is thawed out on the ship and starts killing everybody. Eventually, he gets blasted to bits by the lady robot, reconstructed by nanobots into Uber Jason, and then continues killing until they jump into an escape pod and blast the main ship to bits with Jason on it. This is the real plot. He gets hurled through space toward them, but waylaid seconds before crashing through the space window and ends up a shooting star landing in a lake on Earth 2. Oh, setting up a sequel? No, that's pretty much it. The remake came out in 2009 and basically mashed up story points from the first 4 films. But it was its own thing, not a continuation, as I said. Some of the various comic books and paperbacks tried to tie in the characters and events in the movies, but went off on so many tangents, it's pretty much impossible to try to make them fit in any cohesive way. Friday the 13th, the game was released on various platforms back in 2017 and had a few nuggets that tied into the movie timeline, but that's another story for another time. Supposedly, there's a prequel series on the way at some point, but it's had delays and lost a showrunner, so who knows when, if at all, that will actually happen, or how that will tie into the movie's continuity. So really, for this timeline, that's where we leave Jason, at the bottom of a lake on Earth 2, in the year 2055. Rest, buddy. You killed a lot of people and smashed through a lot of windows. You've earned it. Until next time, Dread Diver out.